Lyrics. Hi friends, host Derek here, talking with famous people. Right now, Floyd and I are talking a little bit about TITE and empirics, use of statistical data. I would agree that people put too much weight on empirics. They think that empirics are somehow more objective than other forms of justification or substantiation, which they're not. Absolutely not. It depends somewhat on what you're trying to justify. If I'm trying to justify a descriptive claim, chances are that empirics are of some value. If I'm trying to justify a predictive claim or a normative claim, that is to say, one that says what ought to be done rather than what will happen, which is predictive, or what is, which is descriptive, the other kind is prescriptive. What one ought to do at a pragmatic level versus a ethical level. What one ought to do in terms of morality is a separate matter than what one ought to do in terms of pragmatics. Well, if you want to blah blah blah, then you should go get a blah 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 as prescriptive. But thou shalt not steal is normative. So that brings me to the topic today, or this video, which is a response to Homie's comment. He says, first, are you familiar with the late Christopher Hitchens? What type do you think he was? Additionally, and completely unrelated, what is your take on objective morality? More specifically, how one determines whether a deed is objectively good or bad. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about. I don't know about Christopher Hitchens. I think he was a famous atheist, but that's about all I know about him, really. This also is also responsive to Homie, who I've already responded to with one video, who came in full of piss and vinegar, and of course I take the bait, as I often do. So how does one tell if a action is objectively good or bad or whatever? So my basic position on it is that there are two kinds of morality. There's a personal and a public morality. So the universal aspects of morality, which are logically deducible and which do not require any sort of transcendent metaphysics or magical thinking, is basically the negative side of rights. So that which is universal in terms of its moral prescription or its normative prescription is going to be universal insofar as it says that which is forbidden. We can determine what is morally prohibited, and it's a universal moral law, and those who violate it are objectively immoral. To the extent that that status it conveys any other sort of thing is not relevant. But regardless, so and the rule is very simple. It's just one of transgression. It's the logical extrapolation from property rights and the understanding that you own your own body. It's logically deducible from the reality that ownership exists in the world and the realities of how ownership is legitimized or how it can be legitimized. It's the most preferable of all normative schemes in terms of universality. It doesn't withstand absolutely perfectly against all hypotheticals, but it certainly provides the foundational universal morality that ought to underpin public policy everywhere in the world. However, a much more challenging question is one of positive actions. To say that which is morally required that one do, because on a universal level, inaction is never considered wrong. So if you see a child drowning and you just get out a new suit and you go, I don't want to get my suit wet, and you let the kid die, well, then there's nothing wrong with that according to the universal objective morality, that you've not done anything evil or ill-intentioned or whatever because you didn't do anything. So you can't be guilty of a wrongdoing. Wrongdoing implies doing, right? So, and yet most people would say that guy has committed a sin of some sort. And this is the thing. Rationalists tend to get very fussy when we start using magical thinking language like sin or anything referencing religion or whatever. Wickedness. There's an attachment in a lot of people to the notion that morality is subjective, that relativism wins the day, that there's no way to determine which morality is preferable, so blah-de-blah-de-blue. Well, that's only true of positive moral prescriptions. It's not true of negatives. So, we can determine logically that it's always wrong to transgress, to violate the rights of another, the negative rights of another, because a right we can define as that which confers a duty upon another. Positive rights are attained contractually between two entities. So it's like if I go to the McDonald's drive-thru and I pay at the first window, I have a contractual positive right now to receive my food at the second window. That's very different than a negative right, which means everybody has a positive moral duty to not transgress against me, to not rob me while I'm in line, to not come up and shoot me in the head, to not steal my food as the person hands it out the window to me or whatever. So that's the first. You got to understand what rights are, and that's how we define right. And the reason we define it that way is because that's what it means. And things that are often referred to as rights, like privacy, is not a right. Privacy is a state of affairs that one can attain via property rights. So because I have possession of this house, I don't own it, I rent, but because I've paid for property rights for a month of this house, I can attain privacy within it by going into the bathroom and closing the doors or something. And so I have property rights to the house that can't be transgressed upon. You can't come into my house against my will and stand in the bathroom and look at me poo or something. But that doesn't mean that I have a right to privacy. It means I have a right to property and I can attain privacy via it. Similarly, people do not have a right to fresh, clean water or something. That's not a right. That's, people have a right to attain for themselves water that is attainable without violating anybody else's rights. Now, you can obviously make a powerful case for, at certain points, property rights when it comes to land being exclusive of the autonomous execution of the rights by all people. And land monopolies are a complicated issue that I don't dispute that they're thorny to the extent that they are a problem. They're not a problem in the United States, but they're intellectually a problem. Let me pull this bong rip. Floyd, I've been just yammering away. If you got anything to say, chime in. All right. So so if we accept that we do have the ability to logically sustain a case in favor of negative rights being a universal morality that is the correct one because it wins all the arguments, which is the only way we can determine anything anyway, then we turn to the matter of the positive moral action. Is it good to save the drowning child? Well, the problem with those questions is, and the reason they're not universal, is number one, unlike with the negative right violation, with the negative right violation, it doesn't matter what the state of mind was. Now, it may change the nature of the liability. If I intentionally punch you in the face and break your nose, I am criminally liable. If I accidentally elbow you in the face and break your nose, I may or may not be civilly liable. And those are ways in which morality plays out. The distinctions within morality play out in public policy or in law. But with the positive right, it does matter though what the intention, what's going on in the mental state as to whether there's any liability at all. So if I don't save the drowning child because I didn't want to get my suit wet, other people think, well, that's not a good enough reason, and therefore I've done something immoral. But if I didn't save the drowning child because I am 95 years old and have both my legs chopped off or something, then people will go, well, obviously, you couldn't do it. Or if you just didn't notice the drowning child, if you're so lost in your head because you're an intuitive and you're walking by and you hear some shouts and stuff, but you just assume it's whatever, children playing over there or something, and you're not really paying any attention, and you're busy thinking in your mind about cognitive functions, you walk right by and ignore it. Well, some third party seeing this as they're coming over to save the child might think that person needs to be punished for his wrongdoing, but he may just have genuinely not noticed it, right? So this is why positive rights can't be universal, because they're contingent. Liability for violation of those rights is contingent upon mental state rather than the nature of the liability being contingent upon mental state. The classic deontological example for the distinction, or something like the distinction, is the train tracks, where there's a train that's gonna hit these 5 workers that are on the track, that are trapped there on the track, and there's a guy, and he could switch the tracks, and if he does switch the tracks with his track switcher, it'll go onto the other track where there's one guy that'll be killed. Now, most people would say it's okay for him to switch tracks and that one guy to be killed, but that if the situation is instead he has to push a very fat man onto the tracks in front of the train, and that will stop the train in time and save the 5 people, that's not okay. And the reason is because of the deontological imperative, which states that you shouldn't use another person as a means to an end, but treat them rather as an end in themselves. So that reality then necessarily precludes treating ourselves as a means to an end. We can't know for sure whether we have a moral obligation to act except through understanding our own holistic and complete value as ends in ourselves, and then we'll necessarily respect the equivalency of the other. Something like that. I mean, obviously, if I were in that situation, I'd want to save the drowning child. I'd want to save the drowning child for lots of reasons. Somewhere on that list would be knowing that I'd feel guilty if I didn't. Somewhere on that list would be, hey, I might get some hero points. Somewhere on that list might be, I feel anxiety about this moment. I've got to resolve it because I'm just so anxious about this phenomenon occurring near me. And then somebody might say, well, what if you save the drowning child, it turns out to be Hitler? It turns out to be that guy who ate people. What's his name? That serial killer. I don't know what his name is. Anyway, well, you can't anticipate that. So deontology makes a distinction between foreseeability and intentionality. So in the first case of the train, you switch the tracks, it's foreseeable that the one person dies, but it's not intentional. In the second instance, it's intentional and therefore immoral. The intentionality and foreseeability issue is there as well with positive rights, but we can't ascertain it in a way that gives us any rules. We can only provide standards. And the distinction between rules and standards is, a rule is something like you can't drink until you're 21 years old, and a standard is something like you can't drink until you're mature enough to drink. There has to be an adjudicator making the decision as to whether or not a given thing meets the standard, whereas presumably anybody can make the decision about whether something meets the rule. And it won't involve the individual's judgment at all. So deontology provides us a rule, that we can check against. Are you using another person as a means to an end? Or are you treating them as though they were an end in themselves? And if the former, then we've done something wrong. And if the latter, we haven't. It doesn't say we've done something right. Doing something right, that question, as indicated, is it's going to be particularist. It's going to be contingent on the specifics of the situation. So, bye, Floyd. That's the answer to the question that I have. I would say it's important that as a world, we start using the word rights correctly. I see all these headlines on Google News yesterday where it says, big win for privacy rights. Oh, there are no privacy rights. And, the right to health care. There's no such thing as a right to health care. There's entitlement to health care, perhaps. We can use that term, which is a real word that people can choose to use that means something specific. Entitlements are things that people feel as though the government should give you. And sometimes the government does. This country has some entitlements. Other countries have even more entitlements. So, I think that people have a moral obligation to not transgress, and that's objective. I think the cultural relativism is insane, and it doesn't matter which culture it is. Any culture that upholds the violation of negative rights is, in that instance, doing wrong. The individual human beings who are facilitating and participating in that are doing wrong. Only individuals take action, and only individuals have moral culpability. So that's one of the other problems, is that people think that somehow that groups are responsible for things. But groups can't be responsible, and we'll never solve the evil of groups until we eliminate the notion that somehow one can hand off one's moral agency to the authority of another and abdicate it in that fashion. Even very smart people like Mark, not host Mark, he's talking about this idealized community where people will share collectively. No. Look, to give up your resources to a collective decision maker is to abdicate your moral agency. To willfully choose to say somebody else can better decide how to use my resources than I can, or that ownership should be undermined, is doing something wrong. It's not just wrong, it's bad. So, and it's not just bad, it's wrong. So, it's both. Anywho, that's the answer to your question. So how do you get to know what your positive moral obligations are? That requires magical thinking. I would recommend God. If you don't like God, then, I don't know, how about gods? You could choose multiple gods. You could have the God of whatever. I'm a member of many churches. I'm the archpastor of Elohorianism. I'm the head founder guy of God's Big Heaven Church. I've ideated a couple of other churches that I'm not a member of, but then it should also be mentioned that the Church of Curtis, Church of Entropic, the Church of the Beholder, a lot of different gods. But I'm more monotheistic now, I guess. If you want to include magical thinking into your repertoire, you're going to have to get over the rationalism or death thing. Most people who watch this are probably rationalists, reason-based thinkers, and they object to the idea of magical thinking, saying, how can that possibly be of value or use? But as a matter of fact, it is, and the answer is, how can it? Well, it's liberating, right? For a rationalist, they're not accustomed to giving themselves permission to do that sort of thing. But if you want to do that sort of thing, you can pray and It doesn't mean you necessarily have to affirm claims about the existence of anything, which is crazy to think. I don't even know what such claims mean, except to say that it's observed. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, that's the answer to your question. And that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.